All right, welcome everybody. My name is Garth Johnson. I'm the Paul Phillips and Sharon Sullivan Curator of Ceramics at the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse, New York. And welcome to the very last contiguous weekly Zoom object study class that we're doing. I am happy to announce that we are going to be continuing the series, but we are going to be going monthly because of something great. And that something great is that tomorrow, the Everson reopens to the public. So members are going to be able to come to the museum starting at noon tomorrow, and we're going to open to the public at large on August 2nd, which is Sunday. So come visit us. Admission is going to be free, or pay what you will for the next month at the very least. But we are taking ample safety precautions to make sure that you have a safe experience to come and visit the museum. My exhibition, Renegades and Reformers, which has pieces that we're going to be talking about today that are central to the museum's mission, are kept in that exhibition, and we welcome you to come see it in person. You can even make an amazing road trip to Syracuse. I'm going to do a few little pieces of housekeeping before I introduce our guest today. So let me share my screen. So you can go visit our website and you can find out information about the virtual programming that the museum is going to be continuing to do, as well as information about the in-person exhibitions, which we are continuing to do for you, the public. But if you're not able to make it to Syracuse, we will be documenting those using our new chops that we've gotten from video sharing over the pandemic. So keep an eye out for all of the information from virtual classes and events that the Everson's going to be churning out. Next week, we are even hosting a virtual wine tasting. So we're going to be highlighting New York wineries and working with the New York Winemakers Association. And we are going to be pairing the wines with some pieces from our collection, and I get to be the lovely host for that. So if you've never been to a virtual wine tasting, go to our website, www.everson.org, and check it out. Another thing that I want to encourage you to do is the Everson has an incredible online research archive. You can search our collection and you can find out information about the ceramic national exhibitions, which were held from 1932 to 1972. And you can even find ephemera and bits from our files through there. So I encourage you to go to www.everson.org. If you click on the exhibitions, you will be able to find the ceramic database. I'm going to give you a quick preview of the next two sessions that we will be doing. For the centenary of the celebration of August as Suffrage Month, we're going to be welcoming feminist writer and political writer Rebecca Sive, and she is an incredible collector of ceramics by women. So we are going to pay tribute to the many women on whom the Everson's collection and expertise are built, and highlight pieces from Rebecca's collection. And then I'm looking forward to, on September 11th, we are going to be highlighting a work by Peter Pincus from a new exhibition that he has at Fair and Contemporary, where he is in dialogue with the artist Saul LeWitt. Peter Pincus is one of the foremost colorists and artists working with color and porcelain, I would say, today. And so this is a really spicy conversation that he's been striking up with Mass MoCA and the Saul LeWitt drawing exhibition, which is a 100-year exhibition at Mass MoCA. So tune in. We'll be showing pieces from Mass MoCA as well as highlighting the pieces and the research from Peter Pincus's exhibition. All right, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce the gallerist Jason Jacques. Jason, howdy. So you are muted, so go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
All right, you are unmuted, and many of us already know about Jason, but he is the preeminent gallerist and scholar when it comes to the world of late 19th century and early 20th century fin de siècle European porcelain, and he has branched out into contemporary artists who carry some of that passion and spirit. And tell us where you are zooming from today.
I'm zooming from the pot vault. The pot vault is in my home in upstate New York, in the Hudson Valley, and which means I do a lot of commuting back and forth to the city. But it's also where I keep all the ceramics safe and sound and in good company with each other.
I want to do one more little announcement before we keep talking, and I'm going to give everybody two pieces of advice. So if you are on Brady Bunch view right now, if you've got the gallery view with everybody's faces in a grid, I want you to stop right now and do two things. So go to speaker view so that you can see Jason and his pot vault and the pieces that we are showing, and you should find that in your upper right-hand corner of your Zoom. You should also go full screen if you have that ability. And finally, if you have questions or if you'd like to say hello from wherever you're tuning in from, you can use the chat feature. And if you're watching us on Facebook, please use the chat feature on Facebook to say hi and ask any questions that you might have. And I will be monitoring those things and can pass them along to Jason. So Jason, I've heard about the pot vault for probably a decade now, and you were actually giving us a little bit of a tour around the pot vault. Could I invite you to actually sort of pick up your camera and do
sure.
just do a quick sort of walkthrough of the
so
enormity of it.
The enormity of it. So let's see, I'm going to try to make sure I don't. So the pot vault goes back. And yeah, it was made by my friends at DigiFab Shop, who are moving now to Albany, but they were in Hudson, and was one of their first projects when they did the house, was to create a cool tiered shelving that allows me to have smaller things at the top and larger things down at the bottom. And they even did the Jason Jacques Gallery logo into the ceiling in a grid. Past little Gareth Mason here, who you know very well now.
Yes, so Gareth, many of you who are in the Everson family, Gareth had an exhibition called Carnal Flux of work that he made here in Syracuse, monumental work. And that work will be shown eventually at Jason's gallery after the pandemic has abated a little bit. So,
yep, there's the pot vault. Some German ceramics, some of my contemporary guys. And yeah, it's a lot of fun in here.
So I can't wait for my in-person visit to the pot vault. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about my own biases, and by extension, I think, the Everson and the American art world's bias when it doesn't come to sort of the world of decorative arts, which is a whole different conversation. But I actually came to ceramics as a maker, and we were talking a little bit when we hopped on the Zoom call about, I like a lot of other people, was trained as a potter, and we're sort of told that there was this guy, Bernard Leach, and Shoji Hamada from Japan, who, really, brought vessels into the world and launched the whole, sort of continuum that led to pottery in our educational system. The GI Bill was instrumental in sort of placing pottery and ceramics into educational institutions, and then like a giant Volcos bestrode the earth and walked in and invented abstract ceramics. And I think the whole time that I was a student, I think that I smelled that there was a larger conversation than all of those things. But it was really discovering you and your gallery that shifted my paradigm completely beyond, the fact that sort of loner artists like George Orr were not exactly loners, and connected into a much bigger continuum. You actually discovered this whole world of European porcelains when you were in your teens. Can you talk a little bit about your first sort of hands-on experiences with some of these objects?
Well, not knowing it, I basically started this at 5 years old. And the first day of kindergarten, I met two twins, Stuart and Tommy Tomk. And the kindergarten teacher put them on either side of me. And Stuart became my best friend, and he's still my lifelong friend. 47 years later. His father had an antique shop. And his father was kind of a strange character who I didn't really know very well because he didn't really like children very much. And so basically if he came home, it meant I had to leave. But in his house, which was lit only, he had a rule that it could only be a 7-watt bulb. That was the maximum amount of light that would come out of any light source. And he had a big Arnold Bokelin painting, and he had like Tiffany lamps and mineral collections, but he also had ceramics around. So jump forward to high school, Stuart and his father sort of reunited after a nasty divorce which separated the twins. And he started working at his dad's gallery, and we started hanging out again. And I was invited finally, as I was no longer a small child that he didn't want in the gallery, to visit it. And in the back of the shop, he had a lot of ceramics. So basically, he loved clay, and but he also liked that it was affordable because French art class was beyond his abilities, and I don't know that he would have preferred French art class or not if it had been within his budget. But he had a case of Clement Massier iridescent ceramics in the back of the shop. And that case was like, it changed my world because as a child, I was always a collector of many things. And my first collection was butterflies. And so my dad would take us down to the rainforest down in Central America and Mexico to collect bugs and butterflies. And the wings of the butterflies, they really resonated. The Massier related to the wings of butterflies being this incredible iridescent color. And it just, I didn't know that, I mean, I'd seen paintings, but I didn't know that I didn't know anything about alchemy. I didn't understand that this magic could happen. And when I saw it, it basically led me on a journey to go find them. And so that was my introduction, was the back of his shop. And I had a job there. I started working there at I was about 20 years old, sort of after high school, trying to figure things out. And it was an incredible education. We would spend our evenings hanging out, looking at old books and looking for pots in the interiors.
So very quickly, I think you found a way to use this to help fund travel and exploration. And I want to ask you a little bit about your first trip to France to try to uncover pots and to dig. But I want to go back a little bit, and if we're talking about the 80s and 90s, can you talk a little bit about or speculate about the market for these pieces and the recognition of these pieces in the United States at that time? I know that Art Nouveau pieces in particular sort of waxed and waned, but at some point I think became firmly ensconced in I think high culture, but that wasn't always the case, right?
Certainly not. And very much like you had the narrative that you grew up with Hamada going to Volcus and this kind of clay. The European story was, Art Nouveau started off as the hippies liking Alphonse Mucha and all of these, but none of that fancy stuff. This sort of romantic period was very popular, sort of post Bauhaus, and the children of the people that bought it originally were dying, and things were coming out of the woodwork. And what became popular was what we know as Art Nouveau. These pretty floral things and these floral ideas in architecture and furniture, Tiffany lamps, and the clay there wasn't many people into the clay. The clay was was kind of like the, you know, the erudite version of this story, but it, you know, it was never expensive. And the big collectible in Art Nouveau at the time was glass, and it was being fueled by the Japanese passion for glass, which is interesting because all of this whole movement came out of Japanese ideas of that craft itself, that a tea bowl was art, that a vase was art, that the idea of making art, it wasn't the Western version where it was about paintings. It was about everything. All of the things that they did with their hands to express themselves were the art. And in the West, we distinguished, you know, decorative arts versus fine art. And it wasn't until these Japanese ideas sort of took root in pretty much France was really the beginning, because of their relationship with Siegfried Bing bringing Japanese craft to the market in France, and that becoming very popular with people like Sarah Bernhardt and Vincent van Gogh and other people that were collecting this stuff. But clay had always been a really important subject in art history in Asia, but not here. So I guess, you know, fast forward 80 years and things are coming out of the woodwork. The Japanese didn't have a glass history. So they were really fascinated by the glass history of the Art Nouveau movement, which was incredible. They, you know, they made, you know, great strides, and they made beautiful things, and they were very precious and exciting, and they were shining like diamonds. So really easy to like them because they're shiny. And so the pots kind of took a, you know, the clay didn't really garner that much attention. So when I looked into this as a kid who had no money, I thought, wow, these guys are crazy, because, you know, I went to the Musée d'Orsay and I went to the Arts Décoratifs, and I saw, you know, these artists were on display as these were the treasures of the period, according to the scholars. But then I went to the antique shops, and, you know, they would be selling the glass and the furniture and the lighting. And under the table on the floor would be the Massier vase. And I thought, wow, this is great, you know. this is my chance. And so Massier became the thing that I was seeking in the beginning.
So the first trip that you took to France as a young man, where you came back and sold some of the pieces to fund your first trip to France, those were largely Massier pieces that you had picked up at that point?
It was the things that were, you know, the more narrative style pieces that were not really fancied by the French collectors, like Chaplet and Delaherche and Dalpaira. They were more expensive than my pocketbook could afford at the time. But things like Amphora from Teplitz, Austria, Massier, you know, because it's painting on a vase. It's very rare, you know, it's not really the form, it's more about the pictorial imagery, the painting, the glaze painting on the object, where the object became a canvas. So maybe that's why it wasn't so popular, I don't know. But they were, I remember very clearly that there was my first Massier vase was in a very fancy Art Nouveau shop in the Louvre des Antiquaires, which is right across the street from the Louvre, which was a collective market. And they had all this incredible furniture, and underneath the table was a Massier vase. And it was like glazed, like a nuclear reaction of glaze. It was so bright and so incredible. And on the top of the table, they had a couple little tea bowls by Auguste Delaherche. And the little bowls were like, you know, $1,500, $2,000. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And I picked it up. And of course, you know, they were a little bit nervous with me because, you know, I'm a long-haired hippie kid that had just gotten off a Grateful Dead tour. And they're like, you know, why is this kid with a backpack looking at these bowls? And I said, oh, it is Auguste Delaherche. And they're like, wow, he knows what it is. And then I said, you know, how much are they? And then I said, well, what about that thing under the table? He goes, oh, it is Massier. It is $500, you know, nobody wants it. And I'm like, well, I want it. So, so that was my first experience with buying a Massier in Europe.
Amazing. So we're going to get into some of the, I don't know, things that drove artists and talk about competition and what things were like at the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th century. But I want to talk a little bit about what was going on in the United States. And I think, and use the lens of the Everson to talk about what was going on here, and then it'll be a little bit sort of out of order, but then we'll go back to talking about Europe. So I want to bring up Adelaide Robineau in particular, who is the reason ultimately that I'm sitting here, because the Everson, or the Syracuse Museum of Fine Art, began to collect her work as art back in 1916, and she lived here in Syracuse. Back in 1916, I think the Everson picked up about 33 pieces directly from her. And this was, I think, 5 years after the Scarab Vase had been created. But there's an interesting history to artists who wanted to work with stoneware, and artists who wanted to work with porcelain and wanted to do like grand fou, high-fired works in the United States. I'm going to go back to my screen sharing for just a moment. And I'm going to go back very briefly while you were talking about Art Nouveau. I flashed up a photo when you Google image search, which is the worst way, but an interesting way to do research about popular images. These are the images that come up for Art Nouveau, and they're almost all Muha posters. Let's see. So there are interesting outliers in the United States when it comes to making work that has this sort of flamboyant, passionate exploration of porcelain and material and glaze. And one of the sort of very earliest practitioners who really show this are the Chelsea and Dedham pottery and the Robertson family, who are in Massachusetts in the Boston area. And this is a piece that's actually in the Everson collection by Hugh Robertson, potter from that family. And he was chasing after some of these oxblood, sang de boeuf, flambe, red colors. And, I think devoted a great deal of his own energy to doing that. And he was very influenced by Chinese vase forms, and a lot of his forms are very conservative, but not always. But his glazes could be so, I don't know, sort of flowing,
rich,
and bold and rich. The MFA in Boston in particular has a piece that has a lava component to it. And so this is from about 1900. This is a really, really lovely Robertson vase at the time. I think this is Dedham pottery. And do you actually, I don't know a whole lot about what Hugh Robertson was seeing. I know that a lot of the artists who were doing this work were going to World's Fairs and expositions and looking carefully at a lot of other work, particularly I think the genesis in the United States of a lot of this work was the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. And we know that Robineau went to that. We know that Susan Frackleton from Wisconsin went to that. We know that Mariah Longworth Nichols, who founded Rookwood, went to that. And the work in 1876 from Europe that was at this exposition blew minds. And this was a little bit like the Sex Pistols concert in Manchester in 1976, where it seems like everyone who saw it went out and formed their own band. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, of what you see as the sort of back and forth dialogue, and how American artists are seeing and absorbing all of this work?
I lost you there. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay. Well, it all comes back to Sèvres, to the national manufacturer in France. I pulled out a little very early Sang de Boeuf Sèvres vase from 1885. And, you know, the national manufacturer in France was a state-sponsored.
Why are we up here?
Somebody need to be on.
I think you're always there.
Hold on. Okay, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, so I pulled out the Sèvres vase here. So the national manufacturer in France was state-sponsored. They, you know, porcelain, the big, you know, the big fight within European monarchies to get porcelain and to get to understand and to figure out how to make porcelain, which is a whole other story. All that money went into this national manufactory, and so the chemistry, the alchemy that was going on at this period, you know, European Western chemistry, the study of chemistry, there was a big scientific breakthrough in our understanding of the elements of the universe. And at Sèvres, they spent a lot of time experimenting, and they figured out how to remake this Sang de Boeuf glaze, which they'd actually lost in Asia. And so that, it comes to them. It comes back down to this centralized government sponsored manufacturing of chemists, cylinders. But then the porcelain doesn't like really give the Sang de Boeuf that richness that Robertson vase does. And it was the renewed interest in stoneware as a material that allowed them to figure out how to really advance that Sang de Boeuf into something that's as magical as the vase you just showed us.
So I'm going to press pause for just a moment, and I know that we've got a lot of makers that are in on this call. I was sort of looking through the list of people who are here, and I see lots of people that I know and love. Wanted to talk a little bit about kilns and firing, and this is even stuff that, you know, I am no expert on, but I know that at Sèvres they actually had large wood-fueled kilns that they worked with saggers, right? So everything was packed into a sagger, and they had sort of large beehive kilns from what I'd seen sort of back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Do you know?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you were asking the experts, the makers. Well, yeah, most certainly. And there really wasn't a kiln that had ever been invented that they didn't have at Sèvres. I mean, they put the money into the research and into the technical expertise to really to take it to the distance. And that, you know, that trickle down, we'll call it a trickle down economy of alchemy into the what I call the French art pottery renaissance.
So I'm going to go back to talking about Adelaide Robineau and the potters in the United States. So let me go back to my video or my presentation here. Okay, so we have Adelaide Robineau, and the Everson is fortunate to have something like 130 or 140 of Robineau's pieces. When she died in 1929, her husband was able to sort of place a lot of the pieces that were nearest and dearest to her heart in the Everson. But her story is really interesting. She came to ceramics as a China painter. And it's interesting, the gender divide. See, I want to ask you when we get back to talking about European porcelains to talk a little bit about the gender divide. But it's interesting that it seems that in large part in the United States, a lot of the art potteries that were built up, like Rookwood and Pewabic in Detroit, came from women who had connections to China painting and ceramics, but who developed a passion for controlling every part of the material. And so that was Adelaide Robineau. She was already a successful China painter. She came from a modest background. She was a teacher. She taught China painting pupils, but at some point right around 1900, she just gets like the fever. She totally develops this hunger for working in porcelain and controlling every facet of the material. So she starts to teach herself, starting around 1900, to actually throw pots on the potter's wheel, which, was a very uncouth thing for women to do at the time. Martin Eidelberg, actually, in his collection, which I believe it's now in the Met, has the very first handmade porcelain vessel that Robineau ever made, and I should have grabbed an image of that. But in a 10-year period, she goes from making her first handmade piece of porcelain to learning to start to throw pots in about 1903 to making the piece that she stakes her reputation on, which is the Scarab Vase in 1910, which absolutely blows my mind. I think I've been throwing pots on the potter's wheel for over 25 years, and not a day goes by that the world doesn't thank itself that I'm a curator now instead of making pots and throwing pots. But Robineau immediately sort of fixates on the potential of working in porcelain. And I want to point out, Jason, you mentioned formulas for porcelain and the availability of porcelain in that whole conversation. And a lot of people on this call probably won't realize that porcelain was only a material that was used in factories. It was not something that was available to casual ceramic artists and casual hobbyists. I'll put you on the spot, Jason, but do you know the story of how Adelaide Robineau started making her own porcelain and where she got that formula from?
I do not, but I because she did it before Taxile Doat arrived in the United States.
Okay, so she did it before Taxile Doat arrived in the United States. And so for those of you who don't parlez-vous fin de siècle French porcelain, Taxile Doat was a very successful artist who actually hailed from Limoges and had worked in the highest levels of the French sort of porcelain industry. And this is very interesting because many artists were very secretive and kept all of their formulas to themselves. But Adelaide Robineau was a teacher herself and really started publishing her own magazine in 1900 or 1901 to share information with the rest of the world. But she actually wrote to Taxile Doat, who I don't think really at that point knew her from a person on the street. And she asked for his porcelain formula, which he supplied. And then she did her own experimentation with the materials that were available to her and developed her own variation on Taxile Doat's porcelain. So that original porcelain recipe for high fire porcelain actually came from Taxile Doat. And then she actually got him to share his entire sort of book and treatise on doing high fire grand feu porcelain. And pardon everybody that I am not a French speaker and I will butcher French this whole conversation. But she has it translated very scrupulously. She publishes it in sections in her magazine, Ceramic Studio, and she really introduces high fire grand feu porcelain to a sector of hobbyists and artists in the United States who didn't really have access to it. So she was tenacious, she was curious, she was not afraid to knock on doors and ask for things. But then she used the muscle of her magazine, which was an instant success, to push this information out into the world. And her audience was kind of little old ladies and society women who were porcelain painters, china painters, and she was trying to lift their sense of taste. Before I go into talking about the Scarab Vase in particular, Jason, I know that you have like an incredible lust to be able to sort of get up close and personal with the Scarab Base. We've not been able to make that happen because it was stolen once, actually, in 1989, and that's a really interesting story. So it's kept under alarms and lock and key and like crazy cases. But I'm going to get you up here, and we are going to do some sort of close examination of the Scarab Vase. But are there bits about Adelaide Robineau that have sort of come to you through your study of the European end of things?
I wouldn't say it came through my study of the European things. It's just that, ultimately Taxile Doat came to the United States and charged up the University City, St. Louis project of bringing this French expertise to the U.S. This Grand Feu, the book that he published that is in French and English, so that all this information was disseminated finally, and really changed I suppose now I know now more because of her in some senses, because here she is publishing this information in her magazine, but I didn't know that until today, actually.
So I'm glad that you brought up University City, and that's a perfect transition. And it's interesting that so for those of you who don't know, Adelaide Robineau's mortal remains, her immortal remains, are here at the Everson. And when she died, she actually designed her own cinerary urn for her ashes and her husband's ashes. And that urn is actually in the permanent collection and lives 24/7 in the permanent collection of the Everson. So Jason, when you come visit, we will bring out Robineau's urn as well. So in 1910, this educational experiment was created in University City, which is right outside of St. Louis.
Not 1907?
Well, the ceramic portion of it, I guess, was more like 1909, but it has its roots a little bit earlier than that. So you're absolutely right. But they decide that this is going to have a ceramic component, and they invite Adelaide Robineau, Taxile Doat, and Frederick Hurton Reed, who went on to design Fiestaware, actually. And a lot of you will know Frederick Hurton Reed through that. But they were the three faculty members who oversaw.
Don't forget Emile Duflo.
Okay.
So, because Taxile Doat's glaze chemist came too.
Yes. So I actually wanted to bring that up too. So Taxile Doat brings his glaze chemist. They bring in the best kilns. They hire the best assistants and chemists. And one thing that actually drove Adelaide Robineau and drove her crazy was that she, as a woman, was not given access to that chemist or the other assistants. And she was sort of left to dangle and do her own thing, as the two men sort of had an army of assistants to help them do what she did. So she had a real chip on her shoulder, and the Scarab Vase, I think, came about in large part because she needed to make a statement piece that wouldn't only announce herself to the world as an ambitious artist, but also she was getting back at, the two men who were strutting around the University City facilities, and I think getting all.
Was that a French strut?
So that was my French strut. So
yeah.
Sorry to any of the Francophiles in the audience today. So that is the undergirding of the Scarab Base. And so I'm going to bring up the photo of the Scarab Base, and we're going to zoom in and show a few things, and then I promise you we are going to get to the pot vault, everybody, but I couldn't do this without talking about Adelaide Robineau. Okay, so there she is actually doing the carving of the Scarab Vase, and lots of you think that the Scarab Vase, from seeing it in art history textbooks in college, it looms large as like a 2-foot or larger object. With its base and with its lid, it might clock in at about 18 inches. So here's an image, I'm guessing, of Adelaide Robineau pretending to carve the Scarab Vase. But the Scarab Vase is thrown on a potter's wheel. I'm going to tell you something about that throwing in a moment. But some of the things that make it notorious and famous and immortal are that it took Adelaide Robineau reportedly 1,000 hours to do the carving on the Scarab Vase. So for those of you who are makers in the audience, she made the piece out of porcelain, and this is bone dry. She dried it completely. And all of the carving that you see here, and I want to point out that the incising on the sort of cartouches with the scarabs here is done so deep. And the porcelain is eggshell thin where she's done the carving and incising on the pieces. So she spends 1,000 hours doing the carving on the piece. She puts it in the kiln, and this is at University City that she does this. So she's using the best kilns and the best technology that they have at the time period. After the piece comes out of the kiln, it was cracked, and it was majorly cracked. And so the cracks on the Scarab Base happened on the very bottom of the piece. They're on the base. And supposedly the cracks came up where I'm showing you with the mouse here, and they were substantial. And so if you can imagine spending 1,000 hours making a piece that's a middle finger, you know, to these strutting French dudes who are sort of not giving you the resources that you need, and expecting you to be the, I think, you know, sort of teaching member of the faculty. She doesn't freak out. She doesn't have a fit and, you know, throw the whole thing away. She gets out her calcined, pre-fired, powdered porcelain, and she packs it into the cracks. She recarves it. And I think that it takes several firings, but it comes out of the kiln finally as you see it. And I can tell you that if you're looking along the outside of the bottom of the Scarab Base, this is a detachable base, by the way, that has carvings that go all the way through, you can't see any trace of cracking. I just wanted to show an extreme close-up of the Scarab Base. So you can see that with this Celadon glaze, so not only is the carving really extraordinary, but she very carefully has glazed this, and she used sort of a fat brush to flow the glaze on and applied all of the glaze for the piece sort of with a brush. So here we're looking very close up at the Scarab Base, and it's actually amazing to me how organic the Scarab Base is. So here you can see the way that this clear glaze or white glaze sits on the surface of the carved pieces, and she's spent a ton of time glazing this piece as well. Well, Jason, I don't know if I've shown this image to you, but on this side, you can actually see how translucent the clay body is, and you know how extra thin that parts of the Scarab Base's porcelain is, where she's
remarkable
carving. It is crazy. And I've only really gotten a chance to get up close and personal and handle the Scarab Vase just once. But it's exciting to me as a maker that the Scarab Vase still on the outside bears significant cracks and on the bottom of the piece. So you can see the stress cracks and the firing cracks, which she just kind of let it be on the bottom. A lot of you who have handled Robineau pots know that the bases of the pieces, a lot of the time because of the flowing glazes, she had to grind the heck out of the bottoms of the pieces. You can see some wax from us keeping it waxed down here. But it's inscribed with the title of the piece, the apotheosis of the toiler, the date. She also numbered her pieces as well. And it says that it was made for the American Women's League. UC is University City. So that's pretty extraordinary.
That's an exuberant bottom.
Yes, it is an exuberant bottom for sure. But I want to share something that I teased that was in the promotional material that Jason sent out in his email, and we shared this as well. And I apologize that this is not sort of the greatest quality video. It was really done for the class that spawned this session at Syracuse University. But we got the Scarab Vase out and we took an endoscope, which if anyone has had a colonoscopy, will, you know, send some chills through you, but a flexible camera with a light on it. And we put that into the Scarab Vase and really examined up close the Scarab Vase for the first time on the interior. And it was interesting that it told me a few things that I don't think that I have any record of anybody ever doing writing about. So bear with the awful quality of the video here. You can see the lid, but here we are looking into the Scarab Vase, and you can see the iron spotting that's on the bottom of the piece, which I'm still not exactly sure why. It had to have been fired with the lid on it. So there were impurities in the porcelain or in the glaze that are apparent in the bottom. But you can see the throwing rings here. But one of the things that you'll notice are these little boogers of porcelain. Adelaide Robineau is rolling over in her urn right now. But I believe very strongly that those little flecks of porcelain are where she's carved through. And I know for a fact that she carved through the porcelain in looking at the inside. And so she's taken porcelain slip and she's patched the Scarab Vase with the porcelain slip. You can also tell that it was put together in two pieces, and a lot of that's the teaching of Charles Fergus Binns at Alfred, from whom Adelaide Robineau took some lessons. So you can see the point right around here that the two pieces are put together. And I think that's one of the things that we're kind of looking at. You can really see that right now. So hopefully any of you who are actually makers, or even those of you who aren't makers, can appreciate a little bit more the construction of this object. And part of the beauty of the Scarab Vase for me is the fact that it is not a perfect object. This is 1000% the labor that went into it. You can really kind of see that. Jason, have you ever gotten a chance to take endoscopes to any of the pieces in the pot vault?
I have not.
I encourage it. You can get one for like $30, and it is a lot of entertainment.
I did have a double gourd vase once that I sold to a client, and it was rattling, and the client got upset that there was something, that it was broken inside, they thought. And so I sent it to a friend of mine who was a plastic surgeon, and he got in there and he found that there was a pencil that had fallen inside of it. Oh my God. And so he did a pencilectomy and we sent it back to the clients. They were happy that it wasn't broken inside.
Okay, that is lovely. I want to remind people that you can ask questions via the chat feature. I just want to share a few things very quickly, and we are going to move on to the meat of this presentation. But Jason, I brought this out specifically for you.
Ooh.
And this is one of my very favorite Robineau pieces, and it is a piece that she did not release to a buyer during her lifetime, but she kept it in her own collection. And I imagine from her point, this is a mixed success, but she actually did this concurrently with the Scarab Vase. So this was done right around 1910 in University City. So she was working with lava glazes, and the surface of this thing is so incredible. And the amount, so this is lava and crystalline at the same time, which is an interesting continuum. And this piece is on view right now in the exhibition Renegades and Reformers that I curated, which has the gems of our art pottery collection. But I can tell you as a maker that lava glazes, of course, bubble and they flow off of the pots. And in this case, you can see exactly where the glaze kind of went straight down and stuck to the kiln shelf. And I don't have a photo of the underside here. You can see the bottom a little bit more, but she used a chisel and she chipped this away into some semblance of the original pot. But the bottom is like raw meat. This is one of the most visceral pots that I've seen from Adelaide Robineau or any other maker. And I'm so glad that this was spared from the shard pile.
Me too.
So I thought that you'd enjoy that in particular. And this will constantly get viewings at the Everson. And the last piece that I'm going to show, this is not in the Everson's collection, but it's in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And Rachel Delphia, the curator from the Carnegie, I think is probably on this call somewhere. But this is a lantern. And it relates to a lantern that is in the Everson's collection that you can actually see in the back of the lava glaze piece here. This dates from 1913, so it shows you that she hasn't given up on her ambition of doing incredibly intricate pieces. Look at and this is only 6 inches tall, I believe, unless their measurements aren't right. But look at the intricate carving, and she's glazed this so that the glaze, this is almost like when you buy a bowl from a Chinese market that has the chopstick holes through it that have been sealed up with the glaze. We're looking at a similar process, only this is incredibly, incredibly intricate carving. So Adelaide Robineau kept working until her death in 1929. And a fact about Adelaide Robineau and her lust for uncovering new things in glazes, this is written about in a book that Tom Pichet put out called Only an Artist, that was released in the late aughts, like 12 or 13 years ago. But Adelaide Robineau was driven by her experimentation by glazes so much that by the time of her death, which was of a horrible leukemia, I believe, she was experimenting with uranium glazes at her death. And I'm anxious to uncover more about that, but it's been written.
About the relationship between uranium and leukemia?
Yes, well, I don't know the extent to which she was experimenting with uranium, but I think, you know, there's likely causation there. And so, you know, the sort of commitment of these artists sort of with their own sort of health that sort of drove them to sort of crazy ends. Okay, so that's Robineau. But I want to move to talking, tell us about opening up your own gallery. And this came in about 2007 that you opened the Manhattan space.
I opened, well, I opened this location in 2005.
2005.
And yeah, and the first show was called Masterpieces of French Art Pottery. But before you do that, I just wanted to share one lava glaze with you.
Yes, hold on.
I know you love lava glazes.
Pin you really quickly.
I just want to share a great lava glaze.
Okay.
Can you see that?
God.
I know you guys were talking just to show that I love lava glazes. This is George.
So tell us about who's the maker of this piece?
It's George Orr.
It's George Orr. Okay, that stand as an or to me, but
this is I don't have a lot of American anything here, but because I'm a glaze junkie, love that glaze porn, you know.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you're an expert at fanning those flames.
So back to the gallery. Yeah, 2005, and I had been in the in the flea market before that. So what was the question? The question is the gallery. Yeah, so the gallery, you know, I really wanted to, I mean, my dream was to have a space that we could do what we were doing and actually be taken seriously. And it's funny how location does that. And I had been from 1999 to 2005, I was in in Chelsea in an antique center, which was, basically part of the flea market there, because there was actually flea markets still, because there was none of those big high rises had been built yet. And all of those empty parking lots were the Saturday morning flea market, Saturday and Sunday. And then dealers that had, maybe slightly better things, or maybe more of a commitment to like a singular purpose, rented stalls in these antique centers. And so that's where I got my New York, the beginning of this gallery. And so what was interesting was we've been doing some shows that at the flea market, and published a couple of catalogs, and had some museum curators come and buy things. But because of our location, like the curator would come, and then he would bring the director, or rather the boss curator, and you could always see that they were like, why are we here? Like why are we giving this kid, our attention? And when I moved uptown and did the gallery on 73rd Street, I mean, the difference, it was hilarious. Like the same client, same collector that had been looking at an object for 5 years at my stand at the flea market came to the gallery uptown, and I didn't change the prices. And he looked at the same object, forgetting that he had ever looked at it before, even though he'd looked at it, for years. And I hear my dog howling. Oh, I wish he would stop. Sounds like he's like hurting. Yeah. And he comes and looks at this object, and it was like $3,500 or something. And for years he told me how expensive it was. Then he saw it uptown. He's like, why is it so little? He's like, why is it so little? And it just goes to show how how psychology plays such a huge role in the way people perceive things. And so I think that those years from 2005 to 2010, where we were consistently, I had a full-time scholar that was writing catalogs for us and all the entries on the website, and researching every object. And I was flying around buying the best things that I could, trying to control the European pottery market. And the curators from American museums were getting to know me, and then we did the Paris Biennale. We wrote Exotica, which you got a copy of recently, and we're talking about with me. But because of the location, it was suddenly taken more seriously, and it was a good move. It was a good move.
So I want to put in a plug for visiting the gallery in person when you're able to do so, and also for the two major books that Jason has released, the Exotica book, which was not a recent book for me, for sure. I think I probably got my copy 8 years ago or something, and it really was an incredible turning point for me. And if you're interested in more swashbuckling adventures in fin de siècle porcelain, the Jason Jacques Gallery's recent book, 30 for 30, celebrating their 30th anniversary, is incredible. And you have a summer reading bundle that people can pick up, right, Jason?
Well, I suppose so. But yeah, I think basically we bundled everything that we've ever published into a single, sale, so that, and at like 50% off or something, something to compete with Amazon, and you could get it all for not very much money.
And I'll put in an additional plug for the recent Beth Kavanagh book, which recently won a major sort of book design.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Yeah.
It's incredible. Okay, so what would you like to, if I could give you dealer's choice of starting with one of the artists that we talked about. A lot of what we're dealing in here, I think, is really feeling based, and I think that
yeah, let's pull down Massier, just because.
Okay, great.
Just because it started there for me.
Oh.
So
And
this
so,
is the mushroom vase. The mushroom vase, although I have not located the original mushroom vase, which would have been executed by Lucien Lévy-Dormer, who's best known for his symbolist paintings that you can find at the Musée d'Orsay. And there's actually a room at the Met where he had done the entire room, the boiserie and all of the pastel colored friezes around the room. So they're in the Impressionist wing at the Met. There's a Lucien Lévy-Dormer room. But he was an Algerian Jew who emigrated to France in the 1880s, and he befriended a ceramic artist named Clement Massier, who came from a long line of ceramic makers in Gulf Juan, which is Vallauris, basically where Picasso ended up. This tradition of the Côte d'Azur French ceramics is really centered in Vallauris. And Massier's family was one of the pioneering families, and they made these, barbotine garden furnitures and big, colorful pastel things that you would buy when on your trip down to the south of France for your summer vacation to get the cure in the Mediterranean. And they had clients that were, royal families from all over the world would come and do the south of France thing. And a trip there wasn't complete without a visit outside of, it's very near Cannes, maybe, I don't know, 30 minutes from Cannes. And they would go and they would take a trip to the Potter and buy some big, beautiful planters for their garden. So Lucien Lévy-Dormer and Massier, Lévy-Dormer had a collection of Hispano-Moresque ceramics, which are early iridescent, the earliest known iridescent ceramics. That was a lost art form that they lost in the 12th century. And along with Italian chemists who were also searching for this magical formula, they transformed it with modern alchemy, with modern chemistry, to create these iridescent glazes. So, there's this incredible spectrum of iridescence. So instead of it just being like this sort of magenta color, that they had kind of like a gold and kind of a magenta. And they released their first pieces in the 1887 World's Fair, or 1889 World's Fair in Paris. But their first successful experiments were in 1887. By the time this was made, which would probably be around 1898 or 1899, they'd really learned how to control it, where that you can, I don't know if you can see the sort of like the thorny brambles.
Yeah, the details are good, actually.
Yeah, so the handles are the stems of the mushrooms, which I think with all the new research in psychedelia is very interesting, with this, that it has to be told, it has to be said that these guys were definitely influenced. That art in this time was definitely influenced by drug use, and it's interesting that they chose mushrooms as a subject matter. But the story of this particular object is kind of wonderful, because I had started my business with Stuart. We did the Los Angeles Modernism show, and there was another dealer who was an amphora dealer, who was older and had money. And Stuart kind of left me for this dealer, right? Not romantically, but to do in business. And I was a little bit heartbroken, and I decided I was going to move to Europe, and really didn't know what I was going to do, but I landed in Amsterdam. And my first night in Amsterdam, I'm kind of jet lagged, and it had just rained, and I'm walking around Amsterdam, which after the rain at night in Amsterdam has got to be one of the most beautiful places to walk on the planet. And I turned down the street, and in this shop of Dutch antiques, in the window was this vase. And remember, I'm a kid, I don't have a lot of money. In fact, I'm staying in a youth hostel, and I have no idea what I'm going to do, couple $1,000s to my name and no idea how I'm going to survive, but determined to not live in the United States anymore. And this vase, I mean, I fell to my knee, like literally on my knees on the wet streets of Amsterdam. I'm like thinking, you know, this is a sign, like this is a sign. And it was so expensive. It was, you know, it was $25,000. He was asking $25,000. I had never seen a Massier. I mean, Massiers were, you know, $500 a few months before in Paris, right? And he was courageous, audacious, fantastic. Franz Leilmar, one of the greatest dealers of turn of the century decorative arts of the 20th century. I think he's still, I mean, I saw him in March, so he's still alive. Wonderful dealer. Anyway, it turns out that it came to me years later, because obviously I didn't have the money then. I tried, believe me, I tried. I called Stuart and I said, you have to send $25,000. He's like, you're out of your mind. And I said, okay. I said, it's the greatest one ever. Said, okay, you're crazy. But years later, it ended up in a show called Out of Darwin's Pond at Dennis and Danny's Gallery, Historical Design. When it was their first show in their new gallery space on 61st Street. And a client that I'd been building her Massier collection bought it. And some years later, she went through a divorce, and she decided that she was gonna, instead of collecting Massier, which was her true passion, she was gonna collect only the work of her Turkish grandfather. And he was a very famous Islamic ceramic maker from Turkey. And so she needed money to buy one of his masterpieces. So I ended up getting to buy it. And so here it is. Like this is like, you know, really like 30 years of story.
So a few things with that. It's amazing that I talked about that reaction of people thinking that the Scarab Base is way more monumental than it is. With Massier, often we have the idea that these are like these little jewels. And so I had no idea that the mushroom base was as gigantic as it is.
Here's a little jewel.
Oh.
This one's a little Lucian Levy-Dermer where he carved back through the thin iridescent overlay, because that surface, that all that iridescence is in a very, very thin glaze that's over a very hard enamel underneath that was turquoise. And so he carved back to the turquoise underneath. But this is
I absolutely love the brush strokes, which on a lot of these pieces.
And interestingly, a lot of these little forms, they made them in miniature, and they also made the exact same form in large scale. But what's interesting about Massier, so he was successful, and he made his money selling things that he could produce, mostly, you know, benches and big planters. And this glazing passion, this desire to this glaze formula was an absolute disaster for him financially, because according to his grandchildren, only 1 in 10 succeeded, and the rest of them, you know, burnt out. They didn't come out of the kiln correctly, and they weren't unable to sell them. So imagine, you know, losing 90. You know, Robineau had to fix one pot. Imagining 90% of your work just being worthless.
Absolutely.
Which is why there's so little of it. There's so little of this particular part of his story.
So we could do an entire segment for sure on
Massier.
On Massier. But can we move to Dalpaira?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's move to Dalpaira.
So you used one of his pieces as the cover of your Exotica catalog, which I showed it very briefly, but let me share my screen and we'll take a look at that pot, which is called La Mer, and it's in the collection of the St. Louis Museum.
Oh yeah, I'm doing an interview here. Why am I doing it? You want to be on the interview for a second?
Yeah, come on.
Come here.
Let's see.
Oh, there's a cherry on it.
Yeah.
Hi there.
Say hello.
Hello. So you're currently
Okay.
talking to a wide
This is my
audience.
daughter, Aya. Yeah, you have a wide audience.
Yeah.
You're famous now, Aya.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Oh, I recognize those.
So, Dalpaira. Dalpaira, from my understanding, and I am not a chemist, a glaze chemist, or a maker, invented the transmutation of oxblood, where he was doing successive firings of oxidation and reduction, and thus able to create these variegated glaze surfaces that included both red and green in the same piece, or red and blue.
And again, I'll remind the ceramists in the audience that they're working with advanced kilns at the time, but you know, smaller personal kilns could be like kerosene kilns, and they were also working with wood kilns. And the fact that they were able to control this level of oxidation and reduction, I think, is something that blows my mind. I can't even do it in a sort of state-of-the-art gas kiln.
So Dalpaira did a couple different. Whoa. Hiya. Can you not play with the pots over there? Guys, can you give me just 1 second? I'm gonna.
No problem. So while you're doing that, I'm actually going to
Yeah.
show the La Mer pot that's in the St. Louis Museum.
Hiya, don't run, don't run, don't run, don't run, run, don't run.
Okay.
I know, I know.
All right. So everyone who's watching from home, this is La Mer in the collection of the St. Louis Museum. And this is a monumental vase. Welcome to my last 4 months as well. I think lots of us have these experiences. It's all about the passion. She's inherited the passion. Jason, so this piece that's in the St. Louis Museum came through you, and it's on the cover of the Exotica catalog. And this is also like monumental for Dalpayrat in that it is about 15 inches wide by, I don't know, 16 inches
17, yeah,
tall.
16, 17 inches tall, yeah.
And I have not experienced this piece in person, but it's been
insane.
in its wall since I saw it. Anything that you care to sort of point out that the viewer at home may not be picking up right away from this?
Well, unlike a lot of his, one of the things I guess, you know, as the makers know, is that these guys were able to recreate things in multiples, but by hand. And there's a pendant to that ended up that I got later and went to the Huntington Museum and Library. But where the glaze pools on these sort of these little plateaus that you're showing right there, and then drip down, you know, you get the richest, the deepest colors. And this one just, you know, just being a tour de force of expressionist, I mean, I think they have it kind of like, you know, it kind of fits very much into this impressionist period of art history, right? So you're talking about like 1897, 1898. But I mean, there's so much force and energy in the form, with it whipping around and spinning and contorting. It's I don't know what to say more than that, other than that, just wow.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think that keeps me coming back to the European porcelains, is that so many of them match the sort of forcefulness of the glaze with forms, and you know, had a sense of Baroque and sort of free-flowing forms that match.
Which is I like that segue to Baroque, because you know, remember, these artists are coming out of that stylistically, but they're also being influenced by this pure, minimal Japanese had shared with them. So you have these sort of two waves, kind of these two streams of ideas that are happening simultaneously, where that one really goes back to this, you know, this Western history in form, but with the very Asian glaze, obviously, and modern Western chemistry.
And the other thing that I'll sprinkle in there is that, you know, you and the scholars that you've worked with have done a lot of work also on sort of the symbolist power of these pieces too. And I think a lot of the artists felt the ability to use sort of medieval and symbolist imagery that it fits with the glaze.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that they put these salamanders on this one maybe even goes back to like the witches. But interesting how they, you know, they use he uses sort of leaf form as an opening. Like the opening is like a lily pad. And then the leaf, you know, continues to become a handle. So it's kind of a pitcher, this gourd-like pitcher form. Love these glazes though. I don't think anyone ever, I don't think anyone ever got Dalpaira when it dethroned him for the richest, most successful glaze.
And this is a stoneware, right?
This is well, it's stoneware that's fired so hot it becomes porcelaneous.
Okay, so it's very vitreous.
They call it porcelaneous stoneware. I mean, you have a lot of, they're combining and mixing. I have other ones that are, you know, more, that are rougher, but this one you can feel this, how smooth that is, and it's vitrified.
So do you have any senses of where some of these pieces lived during the fallow, unpopular period where you could barely give away Art Nouveau objects? Some of them obviously were in decorative art collections and museums, but was there always a committed sort of coterie of collectors who remained true to these pieces, or were they sort of dispersed?
I don't think so, not so much. There was a few, but I mean, I think during the period of their most, you know, their least popularity, when modernism became the code word for, you know, what was cool. I think a lot of them ended up in the basement, in the cellars.
So I want to take a little departure from the sort of flowing oxblood stonewares that we've been looking at, and talk about an artist who came as a real kind of shock and revelation to me. And my awakening to T.A.C. Colenbrander was actually via the Philadelphia Museum of Art, who has a pretty great modest collection of Colenbrander works, but
curveball.
yeah, I think that giving people this little curveball will be good. And I'm going to share my screen again and show a few of the images of pieces that have come through you, and then we'll look at one in person. But I think that there is a kinship in the sort of excessiveness of these pieces. But Colenbrander is someone who is kind of a one-off and a one-of-a-kind artist, and I was actually intrigued by your Exotica book, I believe, had a chapter that really went into his design process, and it seems to me like Colenbrander loved to play these games with doing drawings and then using the drawings to almost sort of make these abstract designs, taking bits of drawings of sort of flowers and floral drawings and isolating them and bringing them to life with crazy colors. The chartreuse and the sort of bright pinks are something that I was exposed to very early on when I was looking at Colenbrander. And Colenbrander is a Dutch artist, and I think that the writers that you've used have written a lot about connections to Islam and Indonesia. But I'm going to stop this share just so that you can show off the piece that you have in your hands, which that Islamic connection, I think, is very obvious with this particular piece.
Yeah, I mean, especially in this frieze along here. So this object was made in the mid 1880s.
So let that sink in, everybody.
Yeah, I want everyone that to sink in, because if you think about Kandinsky, who is kind of, the first of the abstract painters, was doing that stuff in like 1907, I think, in the very earliest point. So my take on it is that abstraction in painting happened way before what is taught in art history, and it happened in clay first. And this is the guy. This is the one. I mean, if you look at this, if you unroll this onto a flat canvas, I mean, this would be modern even now. If somebody was painting this today, we would not be surprised.
No, I think absolutely.
And then if you look at this, kind of like this sort of, it almost looks like Islamic writing in this frieze along here. I mean, obviously it's not, but it kind of feels like that, doesn't it? And then it's said that these pagoda forms are inspired by the Dutch colonies in Indonesia. When you look at like the Balinese temples, and that's where these forms come out of. But it also comes out of the early Delft, these towering tulip porcelains, where they would have these pieces stacked into each other, and for tulips in the Delft blue and white.
Oh, I just get little chills. And tell us about the surface.
Go ahead.
Tell us about the surface and the glaze. So this is actual glaze.
This is earthenware,
right?
This is earthenware. I mean, what's the difference? I meare it's fired. I mean, China painting, is that fired? Isn't that fired?
So it's fired, but it goes over the glaze. So are these different colored slips and oxides that then have a clear glaze over them? Or are these sort of painted color glaze? And the Dutch, of course, were masters with sort of Delft and earthenware, and had all of these ways to produce crisp, vibrant designs and colors.
My understanding is that these are glazes. Different, I mean, so I guess that would be different than what you described as China painting.
Yes.
And then, but there does appear to be another shiny like glaze that over the whole thing, secondary to the glazing that's underneath it, that makes the surface more unified. And when I've seen some of the pictures of them before this last shiny glaze is put over the entire surface, and you can see that that the glazes that are fired underneath it, some of them are matte and some of them are shiny, but they end up then all kind of having a unified final look.
So I'm speechless. It's hard for me to follow up. So
I'm gonna pull out one more. So this.
Yes.
So that was when he's with Rosenberg, and then this is he revisits he leaves clay in about 1895, and is doing textiles, and then he comes back to clay around 1920 after the war, and so this is from another manufactory. But they get really wild and intricate.
And I think it's
obvious, and the color palette, they gain a much more elaborate color palette, where he's developed these, as you had shown in that second image.
Yes.
Of his work.
The acid colors.
Yeah, the acid colors. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so Simon Cottrell asked for the maker's name, and I'm going to type it into the chat. So T.A.C.
Yeah,
Colenbrander,
Colenbrander.
Colenbrander. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And the first manufactory, he was the director of Rosenberg in The Hague, in Den Haag. And then the second manufactory is called RAM, R-A-M, which is in Arnhem. I don't know if you can see that.
Nice. So sadly, we need to actually wrap up our formal conversation, Jason, and I'm going to.
We do.
I know we've talked for 90 minutes already.
We never got to the Taxile Doat.
So let's talk Taxile Doat.
Let's talk Taxile Doat briefly, yes. Because it's interesting. This one is 1907. It's probably the last piece that he made before he left Sèvres and moved to St. Louis. And by far the most insane glazing I've ever seen him do on anything.
Yeah, he was not an unhinged person when it came to his glazes.
Not at all.
I'm going to show an earlier piece very quickly, and it does balance Japanese style glazing with the fussy little porcelain cartouches that he was doing. Oh, and then there are these pieces with sort of ormolu gold bases, but you can see that this is a piece that has this sort of gourd-like organic quality, but it feels fairly buttoned down compared to what you're showing. And then I guess maybe I don't have a photo of the piece that has the cartouche, but sometimes he would mix this organic feel with almost a Wedgwood sort of pat sur pat cartouche. Here we go. Perfect example. I think this is the piece that's actually in Exotica, right?
Yeah. So he was under Louis Salon, who ended up going to Wedgwood and doing the pat sur pat there, was the second at Sèvres to be able to do these pat sur pat medallions, this pasted porcelain.
Gosh. So the softness and the sort of.
And it's interesting when you look at this carved pattern into the porcelain there, how that relates to the Robineau and brings us back to the Robineau Scarab Vase.
Yes. And it's interesting that I get the sense that Taxile Doat is about as pompous maybe as they come, and I think he liked the pomp and circumstance, and he liked making big showpieces that got attention at these expositions. But it must be pointed out that he was willing to listen to Adelaide Robineau as sort of an American woman who was asking him questions, and was willing to share, in the form of sort of books and formulas, all of kind of his most essential information.
And we have to be grateful for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of my final question, something that we've talked about a little bit. In the United States, you have some very flamboyant personalities in, George Orr, who we talked about earlier. And I asked about the personalities of some of these artists. And Doat, I think, was, buttoned down and sort of the academy. And I asked him.
He was also older.
Yes.
I mean, he was already gray-haired, and when he was already like probably in his 60s when he got to University City. He wasn't the young whippersnapper like trying. The fact that he was even able to go away from the Victorian and the Baroque design ideas was a miracle.
So I had asked you earlier if you had crazy Caravaggio-esque stories of some of the fiery personalities that created these pieces, and it just doesn't seem to be the case.
I wish I did. I mean, I think that, I feel like I'm going to tell a little story that, kind of, it's a later story, but I met a very, very important German ceramist named Carl Scheid.
Love Carl
And
Scheid.
so, I'm going to grab a Scheid while I'm talking to you. But so, you know, I was imagining that Carl Scheid was looking at, you know, was making these things and listening to craft work, you know, and like can, and like, you know, he's making these like almost atomic forms, and they're so precise. And I'm imagining that, you know, he's in his laboratory, in his workshop, you know, listening to craft work. I'm thinking, you know, this is from, you know, that's when he was making them. So I thought he must be into the krautrock, you know. I get there and, you know, and I say, so come on, tell me the truth. What kind of music were you listening to? Because I kind of wanted to play that music at the exhibition, you know. And he's like, well, you know, I didn't listen to a lot of music, but occasionally a little chamber music, you know. So in the end of the day, I find that, you know, these ceramic artists who they're just, in general, my experience, they're usually very, very serious people, you know, because the amount of you can't mess up, you know. You have to get the glaze formulas right. You have to have all the science. You have to get the kilns right. You have to get the temperature right. You have to do all of this, you know, rigorous experimentation and writing down the formulas, and it's so serious. Like, it's not just fun and games. And you know, there may have been, I don't know how Volkus was, you know, if he was a rock star, if he was all rock and roll in his daily life, you know. But I besides my imagination, because, you know, I imagine, you know, Lucien Levy-Dermer and Clement Massier down the south of France smoking a lot of opium, you know, and drinking absinthe, and, you know. But I kind of feel like maybe that isn't really the reality. Like, the writers may have been more of those guys, and maybe, you know, Toulouse-Lautrec was part of the wilder scene. But I felt like the clay artists, it ends up that most of them, I think, were pretty, you know, simple, careful, you know, chemists.
So I think, you know, this is a really perfect place to kind of draw things to a close, and it's something that I've observed. And, you know, it's really a part of my life's work, and it's a part of my entree into the ceramic experience is through the maker. So whether or not the artists are, you know, flamboyant personalities who are smoking opium, the artists that we're talking about had an incredible level of commitment, and they had this dogged determination. And, you know, there's this idea that ceramists are just these, you know, hippy dippy people, but you need to overcome adversity and deal with sort of material in the kiln and the sort of lack of material reward that comes from these things. You have to have this crazy amount of determination. And so I think that's the through line, I think, for a lot of these artists. And it's the through line for a lot of the contemporary artists that you work with. So I'm going to end in terms of our formal presentation by just showing an image from your website here that has some of the contemporary artists that you represent. So you represent an incredibly unique stable of artists who work in ceramic and other materials, but there is this sort of flamboyance of investigation of the material, and, you know, a sense of play, whether it is a playful artist or not. There's a sense of play and sort of manipulation of the material and connection to all of these intemperate pieces that you based your early career on. So you have pieces or exhibitions that are coming up from Gareth Mason, who made some of the central pieces in this exhibition at a residency in Syracuse 1 year ago. And then you also have an exhibition coming up from Binda Skutgaard, the Danish artist as well. So I encourage people to go to your website and keep an eye on the exhibitions that you are putting together now.
Because the show must go on.
The show must go on, indeed.
The show must go on.
All right. So Jason, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us. This conversation will be archived, and I encourage people to go back and look at our earlier archived conversations. You can find some really spicy and interesting ones. You can find those on the Everson's website, www.everson.org. So I want to encourage everyone to join us now for the after party, which is one of the greatest parts of this experience. So I'm going to turn off the recording. I'm going to stop streaming on Facebook, and I would invite you to unmute yourselves and turn on your camera to say hi to Jason, to say hi to me. And if you want to continue the conversation about European fin de siècle porcelain, contemporary work, or just life, it would be great to see you. So Jason, thank you again. So hang out with us for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm gonna hang out with you for a little bit.
Okay, awesome.
I
so anyone who wants to say hi.